Hi, thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about blended families for retirement and in estate planning. So let's just dive right in.
The Retirement Readiness Podcast with Tim Regan and Katie Umland. Presented by PrairieView Wealth and Tax Advisors. Live your 2-comma life.
So when I think of blended families, I think of a lot of different things.
So many options.
And like everybody seems to have a blended family of sorts.
Some sort, yeah.
Now, I think probably most people think of blended families with like young children and maybe recent divorce or...
Which is a whole different topic that we'll let somebody else take over, right? Yeah, but it gets even more crazy and messy even like as people get older. Like the things that you think about when kids are little are one thing, but then the topics around who gets what when I die and how can do we share all of our stuff evenly?
And is this fair? Do we want it to be fair? What does that mean even?
Yeah. And is it a blended family that we've had since the kids were 2? Or is it a blended family that we now have and have adult kids?
Exactly. Well, and I never would have like said that we have a blended family, but we do.
Yeah. I would have never thought like even coming into this conversation, it wasn't in my mind like blended, but our mom
kind of
is now married to Al and which is all great. We love the family, but I would not have different. But I guess probably part of that would be they are such a part of the family that you don't think of them as blended, right?
Yeah. It's so funny because it's almost like for me, Al, I had kids after Al. So for him, he's my kid's grandpa for all intents and purposes. So like in that way, I don't think about it as blended, but then in other ways it's like so different. Yeah. So it's this weird,
and it's so funny. Like you just as a quick aside, it always kind of seems like, I don't know, like I need to explain when my kids are like talking to somebody else and like, oh, Grandma and Al, who is Al?
Who's Al?
Oh no, that's just Grandma's Al. It's okay.
And it's like funny because my kids are so little and they just call him Al. Yeah. And I'm like, I wonder if as they get older, is this ever going to be a conversation of like, is it just like, oh, that's how we've always grown up? Yeah. Is that he's Al or is it going to be like,
do they think that Al's just like when some kids call him Pop instead of Grandpa?
Exactly. Or do they know Al's his name? Or is this just like another way of saying Grandpa? Or like, So
which was totally not part of what we were thinking about, but when we had this show like scheduled, but you're right, like there's so many versions of this.
And it's like such a different thing also because we are so blended, but also I have no idea what Mom and Al's estate plan, retirement plan is, but I could imagine that they each have their own things. Like it was so later in life that it is, we are so blended, but everything is still so separate. Like
100%. Well, and even like, I'll use Sarah and I as an example. We have a marriage where everything is ours. There is no mine, hers, like everything is joint. And so if something happened to me, I would expect that all of our stuff is just her stuff.
Right.
And I would want her to do whatever she wants with that money. And I would hope also that she would eventually get remarried and have another great relationship. But I don't really want my money going to that guy's kids. Right? Like that's
who you've never met, you don't have a relationship with.
Yeah. It's like crazy. And so,
you say that, but then like the idea of that sound feels so icky. Yeah. But then if they're married for another 30 years, which they could be at that point, like obviously you still don't know them, but you might feel differently if you knew, oh my gosh, they've been around for 30 years, it is kind of different.
It is different. And so for us, a lot of times what happens is we kind of start viewing life in phases. And so you have kind of your building phase. That's when you're young, you're growing up together, you're raising your family together. And things really start to look, even if you're blended, they really kind of look like this is our family.
Right.
So when kids are little, eventually you start to feel like that is my kid, whether it is because they came in with the marriage or because I actually, physically had them as a child. And so when we have families that are like that, what we find many times is that later in life, all the stuff you were talking about, kind of, they've been around for 30 years. They've been, that is one family. And many times kids, it's like all our stuff is all of our stuff. And we just share it evenly between the kids because we view them all as our kids. But when you have blended families that happen later on in life, you really have a different scenario, because what happens is when you're younger like that, neither of you have any money. So it's not like you're coming to the party with all this stuff. You're building together. That's kind of the building years. But when you come together later on in life, you're now each bringing into this marriage stuff,
assets,
and like very real business kinds of things. And so a lot of times you look at that and you say, well, let's use Mom and Al as the hypothetical example. If Al came in and had a bunch of stuff and Mom had not a lot of stuff, I don't feel right taking Al's stuff from his kids.
Right.
And I would think the same thing. If Mom had a bunch of stuff and Al didn't have a bunch, his kids wouldn't feel good about taking Mom's stuff either. So you have to be intentional with how you plan for that.
It's so complicated because there's so many different things to think about and so many different like ways you can slice the pie, or however you want to say that. Like if you're thinking about your own kids as adult kids, some families have more needs than other families. Yep. So does that feel fair?
Yeah.
Or does it not? There's so many different.
Yeah. And so from our perspective, the way that we typically see things happen is that when you have families that come together in those building years, we treat those as one family, as though they were always a family. Mm-hmm. When you have families that come together post building years, when maybe you're near retirement, in retirement, kids are grown, that kind of stuff, the recipe that we like to follow is where you have his, hers, and theirs.
Okay.
So coming into the marriage, it's a balancing act where you start to say, okay, what's hers is hers, and that is going to always stay on her side of the ledger, if you will.
Sure.
What's his is his. That's always going to stay on his side of the ledger. But now the things that we choose to do going forward, we're going to have an ours kind of mentality.
That makes sense.
And so where that starts to get a little wonky at times is, let's say you have one spouse that comes into the marriage and has a lifestyle that is here, and another spouse that comes into the marriage and has a lifestyle that is lower than that. Now, the spouse with the higher lifestyle doesn't want to change lifestyle, right, but the spouse with the lower lifestyle may not be able to afford the higher lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And so that's where you start to get into that hours part that gets a little wonky, where you just say, you know what?
That's when he goes out to dinner and she's got to make frozen pizza at home, man.
Yeah. I see that going over real well. Yeah. Let's go ahead and sell that deal. I think you could sell that deal if those roles were reversed. If she was going out to dinner and he was doing frozen pizza, you probably could close that deal.
I've seen on probably TikTok or something that's like, men reading, they'll keep a note of all the things their wife says to them that they could never say to their wife. It's like, change your pants before we leave the house.
Exactly. You're looking kind of sloppy.
Exactly. It's like this long list of things that's totally normal for a woman to say to her husband.
Are you actually going to eat that? Yeah. A million things. Yeah.
That kind of falls into that same category.
Totally. Yeah. And so when you start thinking about that, though, it really doesn't have to be like a hard conversation. It just has to be kind of matter of fact. I think what happens is when people start having those conversations, to your point around what can he say to her, she can't say to him, I think what happens is people start to think about that conversation and they get nervous about the feelings and emotion that comes with it. And if we can just kind of separate the feelings and emotion and really just look at it from a logical perspective, then most of the times we can have an honest conversation that then leads to a really good outcome and a really good result. And so, for example, in that if we have one lifestyle higher, one lifestyle lower, we just have the conversation that says, as a married couple, the hours part of this is that maybe you have one that subsidizes the other one and raise lifestyle for everybody. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to, say, an estate plan, the partner that brought in most of the assets, those assets should stay on their side of the ledger and should go to their children.
Okay.
Similarly, you'll talk about one of the hours type of assets many times is like a home. Well, if both spouses put money into a home, you don't want your spouse to be kicked out of the house just because you died.
Right.
And so there's just ways that you put together the agreement that says, okay, either we're going to own some life insurance on each other. And when we die, that life insurance is going to go to the family of my spouse that passed away to buy them out of the house, if you will. And then the remaining spouse just keeps the house. Or you can even put in there that says the house doesn't get sold until both spouses die. Then when both spouses die, then you sell the house and divide it.
Okay.
But the remaining spouse gets to stay in that house for the rest of their life.
I think it's kind of helpful to sit down with like somebody that can kind of lead the discussion, because it's like just you saying, this is what we should do. Typically your stuff stays on your side and goes to your kids. Your stuff, it kind of gives the permission that like, okay, that's okay.
It's an easy out.
Totally. This is what he said we should do. Like, I think just giving like somebody giving you permission to do that when like, that's kind of what you want
anyway,
or thought was makes fair. It way easier.
Yeah. The harder part that we see. So when you've got a marriage that comes in where they both have children, that becomes pretty straightforward and pretty easy. Where it's harder is if you have a marriage where one spouse had children, the other did not.
Oh, sure.
Because the spouse that had children feels like if we have our own people, we should take care of our own people and all of our stuff should go here. The spouse that did not have children, it's just as important to them to maybe support the charity that they had in their mind they wanted to support, or their sister, or, whatever that looks like. And so that sometimes gets a little more sticky, if you will, because the spouse with kids is like, well,
obviously the kids.
Yeah. And so sometimes that can cause some angst, but it's the same thing. It's just, let's just have a conversation around what do we want to do? And there's a logical place to get to, aside from, taking some of the emotion out.
So how does it typically work when when you are talking about like, people getting into later in life estate planning and their kids being involved with that process?
Yeah. And so highly, highly recommend that you have some conversations with the kids before anything goes down, right? Like, so let's sit down and let's be very thoughtful and say, okay, my stuff stays on my side. Your stuff stays on your side. Our stuff is our stuff. If we're going to have a house and the remaining spouse is going to stay in that house, we need to let the kids know, right? So that there's not some tug of war. And what can happen is, and this is where it really kind of starts to get sticky a little bit, is more than the assets, because the assets we can decide, and that's fairly straightforward. What happens though when mom is in the hospital, needs a procedure, and the new husband is the power of attorney, and the kids are there saying, but that's my mom. Who's going to make those decisions? Yeah. And how are we going to navigate those decisions? And so it's having that conversation too, that really just says whatever the answer is probably okay. But it's when people go in without knowing what those expectations are, or knowing how, or that it was
already a discussion between mom and
the new husband. Yep.
And they don't know that mom was involved in that, or, that can get hairy, I would imagine.
Exactly. And so it's really kind of kids understanding what mom's intentions are, knowing who is going to make decisions when we get into that place. Same thing when people pass away. If I'm sitting there and thinking, okay, when my mom passes away, the house is going to be sold, or maybe one of the grandkids wants to take the house, or something along those lines. But the plan is that her husband is going to stay in there for another 20 years. There's no reason that would be offensive or upsetting to me had I known it.
Right. It's the expectation.
It's the expectation that you need to set to make sure that that's accurate.
So what about like, what's your advice on, let's say, your parents' estate plan, what's going to happen, you're on board. So let's say, when they die, you get a chunk of money from their life insurance policy.
Yep.
What's your recommendation? Like, should you plan for that money coming in? Should you ignore it and pretend it's not going to, like, if you're the child knowing that you're going to receive that eventually?
Yeah. So it's a fine line. What we would encourage is that you plan for your own retirement needs. and then expect, like if you're expecting an inheritance, you use that for maybe some of the discretionary retirement stuff. So for example, you should know that you've got enough money saved to pay for your normal lifestyle, stay in your home, do some of the traveling you want, that kind of stuff. But then when you get that inheritance, maybe that's your opportunity to buy a lake house that, it was on the list. We wanted to, but now let's go do something like that.
Or the nice to have list.
It is. Okay. Otherwise, what happens when first mom doesn't die in time? Right? Like, do you really want to be in that position?
Right.
We're like, hey,
I was counting on this. Come
on. Yeah. What are we up to here? You know, but also
gonna have to give her the pillow early.
Yeah. Get her done.
Sorry, Mom, I need new cabinets.
Mom, I love you. Go plan Interstate 80. Right?
Clock's ticking. You got till you're 85 at most.
Yeah. Now I go to the Aunt Edna on top of the station wagon in National Lampoon's Vacation, right? And so you don't want to do that. Also, what happens when mom has some end of life stuff that maybe requires some extra care? And now we need to use those dollars to take care of her. That creates a pretty big conflict if you're like, my retirement was banked on getting this money.
Well, and you start making decisions differently.
Totally.
You have a different mindset of like, what's the actual best choice rather than
exactly.
It just makes it weird.
It does. And so that's why we would suggest your retirement plan needs to be buttoned up on your own.
Okay.
Then if you get an inheritance, now that goes to the nice to have list. And maybe on the nice to have list is pay for my grandkids' college. You know, that's something we always wanted to do, but we didn't quite have the money to save for it. Now we get this money, we can do that. Maybe it is a lake house. Maybe it's, we take the whole family on vacation once a year and we pay for it out of grandma's money type of deal. So it really, that's our encouragement.
Okay.
And we have people that fall on both sides of that. We'll have clients that walk in and say, oh, well, I'm going to get, $500,000 for my mom when she dies. And I think that a lot of times people that have that thought process can use that as the excuse, if you will, or the justification to not make wise decisions today. And that's just, in our opinion, that's
$500,000 sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money in 2025. But if that's
oh yeah, well yeah, and that's the thing.
And the other side does wind up being 20 years from now.
Yeah,
and it is like
yeah, no, exactly. And even if not, right? Like, so let's say that was the case. It's hard sometimes to equate my income with a lump sum of money,
right?
But if I'm making $100,000 a year, that buys me 5 years, right?
Exactly.
We're not talking like I'm on easy street at this point.
A huge lump of money sounds great. But then when you think like, oh, wait, this is for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Like, oh.
Totally. Well, and I think that's where we even get into some other things when we talk about blended families is not all those kids are going to have the same viewpoint on mom or dad and their money. And not all moms and dads are treating their kids the same when they come into that marriage. So where we see things, really kind of cause some angst, and things that I recommend people talk through with an advisor prior to getting into it is, what happens when, let's say the mom supports her kids to her own detriment. She gives them money, helps to bail them out. Her lifestyle isn't what it could be, and she potentially is bleeding herself dry. The husband, who's dad in this situation, doesn't do that. His kids are on their own. They don't take any money. Well, now what's going to happen when mom can't live the lifestyle that dad can live? And dad then starts to get resentful because he's saying, wait a minute, I'm paying for all this stuff just so your kid can get bailed out one more time. Well, what about my kids? And so it's, how do we set those parameters? Yeah. And again, there's each family, we can work through it. We can get to the right answer, but it's having the expectation and having it taken care of first. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you end up in a very bad place in 10 years. And what ultimately happens is it's not just a wedge between husband and wife, but it starts to make this blended family not really a family. Yeah. Because dad's kids now see what's going on. Yeah. They're saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense.
a few other things I was thinking of is also similarly, like, you know, you bring in these assets, they stay mine, but also you bring in your own debts too.
Yep.
Maybe you paid for your kids' college and you're still paying some of that off, or maybe you paid for, you know, you have your own credit card, whatever that is, you come in with those, and maybe the other side doesn't
have that.
Or maybe when you get married, the mom wants to pay for the whole kid's wedding, but the dad doesn't want to pay for his whole kid's wedding, or vice versa. That can also
it's a huge and
get a little tricky.
And again, those aren't insolvable problems. There are solutions there, but we have to have those conversations up front. Because where everything falls apart, and this isn't just in financial planning, it's in life. It's when expectations don't get met. You know, if I'm expecting to have an outstanding experience when I go into a hotel and it doesn't deliver, almost ruins the whole trip. But if I go in thinking I ain't banking on a whole lot, and I get better, or doesn't affect me as much. So
Alex and I are having more babies in July. Babies, yes. There's two in there. So we're starting to have those conversations of like, okay, it's going to be really hard in July. What do we do when Dylan and Quinn both want me and I have to feed the babies? What are we going to do? What's our plan of attack? Or you're so tired, your fuse is short. And I'm starting to pick up on that. What are we going to do? Like, let's start to get a little bit ahead of this, because I personally need that in my head of like, okay, we're starting to, a sense of control. Well, what are we?
Especially because as soon as the doctor comes in and says it's twins, you feel like you have no
control over everything. So I'm suddenly grasping at something that I can control. So it's the same. Just like you said, in
all
everything,
parts of life.
It's setting the expectation is.
Exactly. In that example, if I know that my kids are going to be out until 11 o'clock tonight, at 10 o'clock, I'm not nervous. But if I have no clue when they're going to come home, or I think they're going to be home at 8 and they're not home at 10, whole different story.
Or Alex plays basketball on Sundays right now. Are you still expecting to play basketball on Sundays? Like, that's fine if you are. Same thing, but like, let's get on the same page now.
Don't expect me to be happy about it.
Before Sunday at 5 p.m. and you're starting to get ready for basketball. And I'm
as you're trying to feed 2 kids and take care of 2 other kids.
2 more, and they're in the bath, and you know, so.
No, for sure.
It's the same thing. It's not insolvable, but
we just have to set the expectation, talk through, hey, what are you trying to accomplish? What am I trying to accomplish? What are we trying to accomplish? And what does that look like? And, you know, you talk about, I think we should do a whole episode on adult kids and even not in blended families. How do you support them, and what does that look like? Because if there's anything that we see most frequently that can cause problems in a retirement plan between couples, it is adult kids, and how do we deal with them? And that's not blended. That's even if we've raised them all ourselves. It's how do we deal with those adult kids? So
those dang kids.
I know. You know, I would say, Katie, while you're young, don't have kids. Like, just make the decision now. You and Alex just.
The decision's already been made. I don't think there's turning back.
No. Well, and if I heard right, so you guys twins, but the plan was like 3, not 4.
So we decided, okay, we'll have another baby. As soon as I got pregnant, we were kind of the last few years saying 3 or 4, but it was always kind of 3.
Really 3,
Like, but in our minds, we're like, well, we're open to 4. But we're like, it's 3. So as soon as I got pregnant, we both looked at each other and we're like, oh, okay, this is it. Like, we just felt like 3. That's what it is. Like, Alex is already like putting for sale sign, like garage sale, like he's getting rid of stuff. And then we went to the doctor and he said it's 4.
Yes.
So
God made that decision for you. Well, what's nice now is you get to choose, like, maybe around the age of 5 or 6, which one do you like? So you get back down to 3 if you want.
We have that. Now we have some options like some wiggle room.
For sure. For sure.
I thought you were going to say like 5 or 6 years from now, you can like start breathing again.
Yes.
Because I think that
that will not happen. Sarah and I are just getting there now, and we've got
But now you can't breathe because you're so nervous about them as adult children.
Bigger kids, bigger problems, right? Yeah. And so exciting news for you guys. We got exciting news here too. PrairieView Tax.
Tons of exciting news here.
Yeah. PrairieView Tax up and running. And again, focusing all on tax advice, not necessarily. We do tax preparation too, but more about how do we make good decisions and giving advice on.
So we're recording this middle of January. So is now the time to start reaching out to PrairieView?
100%.
Or okay,
yeah, 100%. By the time this airs, you'll probably be mid tax season, getting all your stuff. And if you're looking for some advice on that, our concept is that most accountants are looking in the rearview mirror. They're accounting for what already happened. Which doesn't mean you're optimizing your opportunities.
So what does tax advice mean if it's not tax preparation?
So it is forward. So we will do preparation, but it's more forward looking to say, I can be intentional with how I make decisions now before I get to the end of the year. What people typically fall into is this cycle with their accountant where 2024 has already happened. I can do nothing to change it. Mm-hmm. Now I show up with my accountant, hand him all the stuff that says, here's what I did. Now tell me what happens with my taxes. That's probably not your most efficient way to think about how am I going to manage my tax liability. More efficiently would be throughout 2024, I'm being proactive in what I'm doing. I'm making decisions with the idea that I'm going to be wise about that. Now when I sit down to do my tax prep, yes, we're accounting for it, but I actually was able to do something about it that was proactive to lower that tax bill.
So they would make an appointment with Bob, bring in past
tax returns.
And then
we'd understand what are they trying to accomplish.
Okay.
What are their goals? And then start to look at, okay, how can we maneuver things
set
here?
Things up for the year.
Yep. And then we typically would have a meeting also in the fall.
Okay.
Where in the fall, we're talking about, okay, here's what we thought was going to happen.
Decisions.
Is there anything else we need to change?
Okay.
Because once you sit down with your accountant come April 15th, there is nothing you can do virtually. I mean, there's very, very little. You've kind of tied your hands with that, where if we're proactive in giving advice on it, we can be very efficient in how we manage that tax liability.
Okay.
So, again, what's the expectation, right?
Right.
And how do we set ourselves up for the best outcome? So that's new. We've got new year, new gear a little bit, where we've got 2 new offices, new in Frankfurt, new in St. Charles. And
so I have a little bit of a bone to pick. You couldn't have moved offices before the construction on that bridge was out.
The bridge was out
for a year. We couldn't have done this a year and a half ago and avoided all of that. I'm just remembering that.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's just how it rolls. Dang
it. But downtown Frankfurt's really exciting.
It is.
It's really nice.
Downtown Frankfurt, downtown St. Charles, 2 great communities.
And that you're both really plugged into. Bob lives up there. And
Sarah and I have been here in Frankfurt for 20 years.
3 blocks from here.
Yeah.
So 5 blocks.
Yeah, it's kind of nice. The problem is that it might be a little too easy to, pop in and
work.
Yeah, or maybe even the other way. Middle of the day, maybe I'll pop home.
Siesta.
And exactly.
If only.
So all kinds of good stuff going on.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of the Retirement Readiness Podcast. For more resources, head to pv-wp.com.
The Retirement Readiness Podcast with Tim Regan and Katie Umland. Presented by PrairieView Wealth and Tax Advisors. Live your 2-comma life. Learn more at pv-wp.com. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe to the Retirement Readiness Podcast on your preferred podcast platform.